How's it going, everybody? It's Warren, and Avengers Endgame was an amazing movie. It was truly a movie for the fans, and it also did justice to the story arcs that the MCU has been building over the past 11 years. This movie is packed with Easter eggs and callbacks and references to the comics and previous MCU films, and it's just so rewarding to watch. So let's break down the whole entire movie and go over the details that you might have missed. But of course, I first must issue a spoiler alert. If you have not seen Avengers Endgame, I will be going over the entire movie in this video. So if you don't want essentially the whole movie spoiled, you should click away. And also, if you're new to my channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I'm giving away a life-sized Infinity Gauntlet right now and a glow-in-the-dark Thanos painting by Glow by Bow. I'll get into more of the giveaway stuff at the end of the video. So the first scene of Avengers Endgame opens up on Hawkeye teaching his daughter how to shoot a bow and arrow. He's at his home on the countryside, and we can see his wife and two sons in the background as well. The first line of the movie that Clint says, "You know where you are going, now let's worry about how you get there." This is actually a reference to the beginning of the MCU. Marvel had been planning all of these MCU interconnected films a long time before Iron Man 1. So they saw where they were going, they just needed to focus on how to get there, and they started with Iron Man. There's a few Easter eggs and callbacks in this scene. If you notice, Clint calls his daughter Hawkeye, and this is the first time we actually hear Hawkeye in the MCU. The closest that we've ever gotten is in the first Avengers film when Dr. Eric Selvig calls him the Hawk. And you can also notice that he still has his ankle bracelet on, therefore he is still on house arrest. After the events of Civil War, both Hawkeye and Ant-Man took plea deals with the government so they could go be with their families. And also, Hawkeye's daughter is played by Ava Russo, the daughter of Joe Russo, who directed the film along with his brother Anthony Russo. But sadly, her and the rest of Clint's family turned to dust, leaving him all alone and leading him to becoming Ronin. We then cut to the Benatar, which Tony and Nebula are stranded on, and we hear Dear Mr. Fantasy playing in the background. This is no doubt Quill's music, and it either comes from one of his awesome mixes or his Zune. We see Tony and Nebula playing paper football to pass the time and try to keep their hopes up, and it goes along with the music that says, "Take us out of this gloom." We then see Tony recording his message to Pepper saying that they've done everything they can, but the ship is stranded. He's ran out of food and water, and tomorrow morning he will run out of oxygen. There are actually a ton of Easter eggs, callbacks, and references in this one scene alone. For starters, we hear Tony Stark say, "Don't post this on social media." This is a callback to the first Iron Man when he's in the convoy and he says, "Don't post this on MySpace." We then hear him say that he's been stranded in space for 22 days. Well, Avengers Endgame is the 22nd film of the MCU. We then hear Tony call Nebula a blue meanie, which is from the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, where the Beatles actually travel through time. There's also a reference to the Beatles in Avengers Infinity War, where Tony says the Avengers broke up and Bruce Banner asks, "Like a band, like the Beatles." Foreshadowing. When we see Tony and Nebula working on the ship to try to fix it, he's wearing a black tank top, just like he's wearing in the first Iron Man film when he's making the Mach 1. At the end of his message, he tells Pepper, "I'll think of you, it's always you." This is a callback to Iron Man 2 when he makes Pepper the CEO of Stark Industries. He says, "It's you, it's always been you." Tony passes out and is about to die, but then Nebula picks him up and puts him in the chair, fully expecting him to be dead any time now. But then Tony sees a super bright light, and it is, of course, the one and only Captain Marvel coming to save Tony. Captain Marvel takes the Benatar back to Earth and back to the Avengers headquarters, where the rest of the Avengers and Pepper are waiting for them. Now, it's interesting that they didn't show in Avengers Endgame Captain Marvel meeting the Avengers. They counted on you seeing the post-credit scene from Avengers Infinity War and the post-credit scene from Captain Marvel to know what happened. And what happened was the Avengers got their hands on Nick Fury's pager. We don't know how, but they did. Captain Marvel traced the signal and showed up asking, "Where's Fury?" From here, no doubt, she explained who she was. And we can probably assume that Pepper showed up to the Avengers headquarters and told the rest of the Avengers that Tony went into space. And from here, Captain Marvel tracked them down, most likely with the help of Rocket, since that is his ship. When they get home, Nebula is helping Tony off the ship, and Captain, of course, runs to his aid. He tells Captain, "I couldn't stop him," and Captain says, "We couldn't either." And then Tony says, "I lost the kid," of course referring to Peter Parker. Tony actually doesn't know if Pepper is alive at this point or if she's fallen victim to the snap. He's about to ask Captain if she's alive or not, but then she runs up to him and embraces him. We cut to a scene inside the Avengers headquarters, and we can see that Tony still has a lot of resentment from what happened in Civil War. He still doesn't forgive Steve. This is the first time that we really see the damage that was caused by Civil War. Tony references back to Age of Ultron many times in this scene. He then calls everybody out, saying that he wanted a suit of armor around the world like he said in Age of Ultron, implying that if he had those suits of armor around the world, this wouldn't have happened. But then he talks about how Captain didn't agree with him and how Tony said that they'd lose and then Captain said they'd lose together. Tony then refers back to the vision that he had in Age of Ultron, saying that he saw this coming. In this scene, we can tell just how afraid of Thanos Tony Stark really is. Understandably, of course, he just got the crap kicked out of him by Thanos, and Thanos just eliminated half of the universe. But he gives Steve his arc reactor and says that if you find Thanos, you wear this and you hide, basically telling him that you cannot defeat Thanos. We can see that Tony still has a lot of resentment left for Steve after the events of Civil War. Ultimately, Tony ends up collapsing due to lack of strength and ends up on bed rest. With Nebula back, she figures out where Thanos is with the help of Rocket. Nebula says that Thanos has gone and retired at the Garden, which is a biblical reference such as the Garden of Eden. This is because after Thanos collects all of the Infinity Stones and has control over the entire universe, he deems himself a god. And this is straight from the comics as well. Also, when the Avengers get to the Garden, we can see Thanos' Scarecrow armor, which is directly from the Infinity Gauntlet comics. So the Avengers get in the Benatar and head into space to go kill Thanos. In this scene, we can see that Captain America is actually wearing his uniform from the Winter Soldier. The first scene of Thanos on the Garden is of him brushing his hands against some flowers. This is taken directly from the movie Gladiator, where Maximus brushes his hands against some weeds. This actually foreshadows Thanos' death, much like Maximus in Gladiator. We find out that Thanos used the Infinity Stones to destroy the Infinity Stones, and then Thor finally goes for the head and kills Thanos. Thanos is now dead, but the stones are destroyed and the Avengers lose all hope. We then cut to 5 years later. Without the stones, the Avengers did not know how to reverse the snap, so they did their best to try and move on with their lives. Steve Rogers hosts a support group for those who have lost people to the snap. In the support group, we see two very important people. One is director of Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, Joe Russo. Joe Russo is who we hear talking in the support group, saying that he went on a date for the first time in a very long time. In this scene, he also marks the first openly gay character in the MCU. But also in the support group is the one and only Jim Starlin. Jim Starlin created Thanos and he wrote the Infinity Gauntlet comic saga. We then cut to a scene with Natasha talking to some of the other heroes who are all looking after the world and other parts of the universe now. Next to Natasha on the floor, we can see ballet shoes, which is a reference to her past as a child and her past that we learned in Age of Ultron. One very interesting and possibly very important part of this scene is when Okoye tells Natasha that there was an underwater earthquake off the coast of Africa. This is most likely an Easter egg for Namor the Submariner. Namor has been teased by Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige for a very long time now, and this actually isn't the first Easter egg for Namor in the MCU. Okoye says it's an underground earthquake, we handle it by not handling it. This could simply be just an underground earthquake, but to me it does look like she knows that it could be Namor and the people of Atlantis. Wakanda and Atlantis in the comics are constantly at war with one another, so she may know that this earthquake is caused by Namor and the Atlanteans, and she knows just to leave it alone. When everybody leaves, we see Captain Marvel look at Rhodey in a very interesting way, and she says, "Be careful." Well, in the comics, Rhodey and Captain Marvel are actually kind of a thing, meaning they're romantically involved with one another, which actually makes a lot of sense considering that they have a lot in common, including serving in the military. The scene ends with Natasha asking Rhodey if she can track down where Clint is going next. Then Captain America comes in and says that I've been telling people to move on, and some people move on, but not us. The heroes clearly cannot move on after they failed to stop Thanos and failed to save the universe. Meanwhile, in California, the whole entire universe is saved by a rat. That's right, a rat stepped on a switch that brought Ant-Man back to the current time. And the Russo brothers have actually confirmed this. They said that in all of the 14 million different scenarios, the rat did not step on the switch all but one time. So it seems like the Avengers owe everything to Master Splinter. The storage number that the van is being kept in is 616, which is a reference to the main comic universe, Earth 616. And the security guard is Kim Jeong. Kim was on Community, which is a show that the Russo brothers also directed as well. So a little Community Easter egg there. The security guard is also reading The Terminal Beach, which is actually a post-apocalyptic book, which is pretty much the world that the Avengers live in right now, a post-apocalyptic or a post-snap reality. So Ant-Man gets out of the quantum realm, and as we know, he only spent 5 hours inside of the quantum realm, but 5 years went by in reality. He has no idea what happened, but eventually realizes that millions of people are dead and missing. All he can think about is if his daughter is alive or not. He goes to a memorial that has all of the people who died to the snap listed on it. He's looking for his daughter, but actually finds out that his name is on it. This makes perfect sense because he was trapped inside of the quantum realm for 5 years, so everybody thought that he was dead. He goes to Cassie's house and he finds her there, 5 years older. She's obviously in shock because she thought he was dead. But then Ant-Man travels across the country to upstate New York with the van that has the quantum tunnel in it, and he brings hope in the form of possible time travel. Steve, Natasha, and Scott go see Tony to talk about time travel, and we find out that Tony now has a daughter, Morgan. This is from Avengers Infinity War, where Tony tells Pepper that he had a dream where they had a child named Morgan, named after Pepper's eccentric uncle, Morgan. Now, in the comics, there is a Morgan Stark, but it is not Tony and Pepper's daughter. It's actually Tony's cousin, who is very jealous of Tony. In the scene, we also see his daughter wearing the helmet to the rescue armor that Pepper will wear later on in the ending of the movie. This also has a double reference to it, as it refers back to Iron Man 2 with the little boy wearing the Iron Man helmet, which was actually Peter Parker. When Steve, Natasha, and Scott show up, we can see Natasha is wearing an arrow necklace, which is a reference to Hawkeye. Scott explains the quantum realm and time travel to Tony, but Tony quickly dismisses it. He says that it's too risky and he won't risk his family. But when he's washing the dishes later on that night, he sees a picture of Peter, and of course decides to give time travel a go and figures it out. While he's tucking his daughter into bed, she says, "I love you 3000, which is actually a reference to the Iron Man 3000 conversion table, oddly enough. But of course would actually bring people to tears at the end of the movie. Tony tells Pepper, "I figured it out. I figured out time travel." But it's risky and he's thinking about just forgetting about it and heading to bed to go to sleep. And then Pepper drops some deep stuff on us by saying, "But would you actually rest?" This is a reference to Iron Man 3, where Tony would try to sleep but he couldn't because he would have nightmares. We then get introduced to Professor Hulk for the very first time. Professor Hulk is the perfect combination of Bruce Banner and the Hulk. You have the brains of Bruce Banner but the body of the Hulk. Professor Hulk and the rest of the Avengers will attempt time travel but not be too successful at it. Tony eventually heads back to the Avengers headquarters. He gives Captain America his shield back, and when he gives it to him, the theme from the first Avenger plays. Tony tells Steve that he has forgiven him and wants to put everything behind him, and Steve agrees. Then Tony says that they need to get all of the team back together, and Steve says that they're working on it. Professor Hulk and Rocket then go visit New Asgard. Now, New Asgard is in Norway in a city called Tønsberg. In the original Thor movie, we learned that this is where Odin fought off the Frost Giants. This is also the place where Odin hid the Tesseract in Captain America: The First Avenger. And it's also a callback to Thor Ragnarok, where Odin was on Earth in Norway and he said Asgard could be here. We see that Rocket is in his original Guardians of the Galaxy outfit from the comics, and when they get to New Asgard, we find out that Valkyrie is in fact alive. And when Rocket and Professor Hulk get to Thor's cabin, we find out that Korg and Meek also survived the snap. Thank goodness. We find out that Thor isn't exactly in the best of shape, mentally and definitely physically. Thor is rocking the dad bod, and it becomes very clear that the guilt of Thor not going for the head originally and not stopping Thanos from killing half of the universe has definitely taken its toll on Thor. He stays drunk all the time so he doesn't have to deal with the pain of his failure, and when Professor Hulk says Thanos, he has a meltdown. But eventually Rocket convinces Thor to go with them because they have a chance to undo the snap, and there's beer on the ship. But there's also a quick little Fortnite Easter egg in this scene. The Russo brothers are very big Fortnite fans. In fact, in an Infinity War Q&A with Collider, Anthony Russo wore a Fortnite shirt. We are then introduced to Ronin, Clint's other persona after his family died. This happens in the comics as well. Hawkeye takes on the Ronin persona after Civil War. We see him kill Akihiko, who was the Yakuza boss and a member of the Shogun Reapers, a science clan who fought against S.H.I.E.L.D. in the comics. Natasha finds Clint and convinces him to come back because they have hope now. There's a chance that they can undo the snap and bring back Clint's family. The Avengers all get back together at the Avengers headquarters and they decide to test time travel. It's successful, and the Hulk explains how time travel works. He explains that if you go back in time and alter events of the past, it does not change your future. Instead, it creates an alternate timeline. So the Avengers come up with their plan to go into the past and collect all of the Infinity Stones. Scott calls this plan a time heist, which is a direct reference to a Doctor Who episode, which is a fan favorite. We also catch the Hulk eating his own ice cream, which was mentioned in Avengers Infinity War. While they're coming up with their time heist plan, Thor hasn't exactly gotten his act together and in fact looks like the dude from Big Lebowski, which is actually referenced in this movie. While Thor is explaining about the ether and where it is, we see a photo of Jane Foster, which is the same photo used in the first Avengers film. The Avengers only have enough Pym particles to make one jump to the past and one jump back. So they split up into teams going to different points in time. Steve, Tony, Scott, and Professor Hulk will go back to 2012. There they will try to get the Time Stone, the Mind Stone, and the Space Stone. Rocket and Thor will go back to Asgard right during the events of Thor: The Dark World, and there they will try to get the ether. Nebula, Clint, Rhodey, and Natasha will go back to 2014. Clint and Natasha will go to Vormir, and Rhodey and Nebula will go to Morag. This team is in charge of getting the Power Stone and the Soul Stone. As I said, Thor and Rocket go back to the events of Thor: The Dark World, and we see Loki trapped inside of a cell. Thor is still not in the best shape mentally and freaks out and starts to have a panic attack. Rocket tries to pull him back together, but he can't, leaving Rocket to go get the ether by himself. Thor then runs into his mother, who immediately knows that he is not from the current time. He breaks down and she tells him that he needs to be who he is and not who he is supposed to be, and also tells him to eat a salad. But this snaps him back into shape and Rocket manages to get the ether. But before they head back, of course, Thor has to grab Mjolnir. He is able to grab it, which means he is still worthy enough to wield it, and this also restores his confidence as well. Back in 2012, we have a whole bunch of nostalgia, reliving the events of the first Avengers film. And here we get to see a lot of behind the scenes events that we didn't see in the Avengers film. We see Loki turn into Captain America like he does in Thor: The Dark World, and then Thor slaps something over his face to make him shut up. And then S.H.I.E.L.D. or Hydra comes in and they take the scepter. On their way down in the elevator, Captain America gets in the elevator and it seems like we're going to relive this scene from the Winter Soldier. Instead, Steve whispers into Sitwell's ear, "Hail Hydra." This is a reference to the comics where Steve is actually brainwashed into thinking that he is a Hydra agent. In the elevator, we also hear some Hydra agents name drop Dr. List, who is Baron von Strucker's chief scientist who studied the scepter in Age of Ultron. We then see Captain America fight Captain America. The 2012 Captain America thinks that the future Captain America is actually Loki in disguise trying to steal the scepter. We hear 2012 Captain say, "I can do this all day," which is basically Captain America's catchphrase at this point. In this scene, we actually see how much Captain has grown over the years. From the Captain that would say language in Age of Ultron to the Captain now who checks out his own butt. Meanwhile, the Ancient One explains to Bruce Banner that changing the past can create alternate timelines. Alternate timelines actually happen quite frequently in the comics, but Bruce promises to return each Infinity Stone to the point in time where they took them. That way no alternative timelines would be created. However, they do create alternate timelines. In 2012, Loki manages to get the Tesseract and escape, opening his story up to a whole bunch of different possibilities in the future of the MCU. And 2014 Nebula is now killed, and 2014 Gamora is now in 2023. So they have definitely created alternate timelines that I'm sure we'll see play out in the MCU at some point. The Ancient One was not going to give the Time Stone to Bruce until Bruce says that Doctor Strange willingly gave up the Time Stone to Thanos. She explains that he is supposed to be the best master of the mystic arts out of all of the ones before, so she agrees that he must have known what he was doing when he gave away the Time Stone. And of course, as we know, he did. He looked into the future and saw 14,605 different scenarios in which they only won one. But part of that winning scenario was giving away the Time Stone. In New York, they managed to get the Time Stone and the Mind Stone. However, they don't manage to get the Space Stone because Loki escapes with it. So they go back in time to the 1940s to Camp Lehigh. This is the camp where Steve was first trained, but would later on be destroyed in the Winter Soldier. But of course, before the scene starts, we have what is expected to be the very last cameo from Stan the Man Lee. He drives by yelling at the government with a bumper sticker on his car that says "Nuff said," which is a catchphrase that he would use in the Marvel comics. In this scene, we see Dr. Hank Pym of the past working on the original Ant-Man helmet. Captain is in disguise, and on his name tag we can see that it says Roscoe. This is an Easter egg to Roscoe Simmons, who would eventually take the mantle in the comics of Captain America when he goes nomad. Tony eventually runs into his father, Howard Stark. Tony pulls out an MIT badge, which is a reference to Captain America Civil War when he spoke at MIT. This is where he got that badge. Civil War, of course, is also where Tony and Steve got divided, and now they're working together again. Howard Stark is looking for Dr. Zola, who was Red Skull's chief scientist who joined S.H.I.E.L.D. but was secretly working for Hydra. Going back into the past and talking to his father is actually a great moment for Tony. Now that Tony is a father himself, the man who he thought was really hard on him, he realizes was just trying to do his best, and Tony finally gets some closure with his father. We also see Jarvis, who would eventually go on to become the voice of Tony's AI. Jarvis is also an Easter egg to the show Agent Carter, who of course Steve manages to see while he's back on the base. We then go to Morag with Rhodey and Nebula, and we get to see Star-Lord from a different perspective. They manage to track down the Power Stone, but right before they get it, Rhodey says, "You can't just enter the Temple of the Power Stone, it's booby-trapped." And this of course is a reference to Indiana Jones, the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Then on Vormir, we basically have the same scene that we saw in Avengers Infinity War with Thanos and Gamora, only this time it's with Natasha and Clint. They realize that one of them has to be sacrificed, and obviously they both want to sacrifice themselves. Natasha says that it has to be her because this is what her life has been building up to, and besides she owes Clint for saving her life and giving her a family. This is a reference to the first Avengers film where Natasha tells Loki that Clint basically saved her life instead of killing her. The two of them fight, both trying to kill themselves until eventually Natasha is the one that sacrifices herself and Clint gets the Soul Stone. Everybody manages to get back except of course for Nebula, who ends up getting trapped by the past Thanos. Thanos learns of the future Avengers plan and sends the past Nebula back to the future. But the Avengers successfully collected all of the Infinity Stones, and Thor wants to be the one to perform the snap because it would make up for him not going for Thanos' head and not saving everybody, trying to undo his wrong. He says that he is the strongest Avenger, which is a reference to Thor Ragnarok, when he tried to access the Quinjet. But at the end of the day, it is Professor Hulk that wields the Infinity Gauntlet, saying that he was basically made for this because it's mostly gamma radiation, which is really what the Hulk is. Right before the snap, we see Tony use his energy shield, which we see Captain America use in the comics. Professor Hulk successfully undoes the snap, but immediately after, Nebula brings the 2014 Thanos and his army into the future, and he immediately launches an attack on the building, completely destroying it. We have a scene where Hulk is holding up the building in order to save Rhodey and Rocket. This comes directly from the Secret Wars comic. We then get to see a new Thanos, Thanos from the past, who is much more like the Thanos from the comics, the brutal Mad Titan who just wants to kill everybody. We then get a face-off with the original three Avengers, Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America against Thanos. Thor wields Mjolnir and Stormbreaker, and the three of them launch an attack against Thanos. Thanos still manages to overpower them, and at one point Thanos is about to drive Stormbreaker into Thor's chest. This is a reverse scene of what happened in Avengers Infinity War where Thor drove Stormbreaker through Thanos' chest. But of course he is saved by Captain America finally lifting Mjolnir. This is something straight from the comics that everybody has been waiting for a very long time and was teased in Avengers Age of Ultron, where Captain was able to slightly move Mjolnir. Captain is even able to use lightning. The reason of this, of course, is the enchantment on Mjolnir that says whoever possesses it will possess the power of Thor. So with that power comes lightning. But it ultimately isn't enough to defeat Thanos, and Thanos eventually ends up breaking Captain America's shield, which is directly from the Infinity Gauntlet comic. Everybody is defeated, and then it is just Captain America, the last one standing, against Thanos. This is also directly from the Infinity Gauntlet comic, Captain being the last one against Thanos, not giving up. It seems like all hope is lost, but then of course we hear Sam say, "On your left." This is a callback to the Winter Soldier when Captain America would pass Sam on the track field and he would say, "On your left." And then we see Doctor Strange bring all of the fallen heroes that are now back to life into the battle. This is also right from the comics where Doctor Strange brings everyone to Thanos to fight him. We finally get to hear Captain America say, "Avengers assemble," and the fight begins. From here, there are a ton of references, Easter eggs, and callbacks. Starting with one that many people missed, Howard the Duck. It's so awesome that they threw him in this scene. Once the fight begins, they realize they need to get the Infinity Gauntlet back to the past, and the only option is Ant-Man's van. We hear the Wasp say, "We're on it, Cap," which is a reference to Ant-Man and the Wasp, where she would make fun of Ant-Man for saying Cap. Peter and Tony finally reunite, and we find out that people who were dusted actually remember being dusted. And Peter finally gets his hug from Tony, unlike what happened in Spider-Man Homecoming. The gauntlet then makes its way across the battlefield. First Hawkeye has it, and then Black Panther takes it. When Black Panther takes it, he says, "Clint, give me the gauntlet." This is a reference to Civil War. In Civil War, Hawkeye says, "My name is Clint," and Black Panther says, "I don't care." Now it seems like he has some respect for him. This is also a direct reference to the comics where Black Panther wields the Infinity Gauntlet himself. Then Spider-Man takes the gauntlet, and we finally get to see his instant kill mode that was mentioned in Spider-Man Homecoming. Then Captain Marvel comes in, destroys Thanos' ship, and goes to Peter and gets the gauntlet from him. We then see all the female heroes gather with Captain Marvel. This is a direct reference to the A-Force, the all-female superhero team, and probably foreshadowing and setting it up for the future A-Team in the MCU. We also see Quill interact with 2014 Gamora. Peter is shocked to see her alive, but of course it's not the same Gamora, it's 2014 Gamora. She kicks him in the nards and then vanishes. Eventually Thanos destroys the quantum tunnel in Ant-Man's van and gets the Infinity Gauntlet from Captain Marvel. Right then, Tony looks at Doctor Strange and Doctor Strange puts up his finger, signaling 1, meaning the one scenario in which they win. And immediately Tony knows what he has to do. He goes against Thanos and manages to get the Infinity Stones from the Infinity Gauntlet. Before he snaps his fingers, he says, "I am Iron Man." The phrase that started it all, and now he's using it to end it all. After he uses the gauntlet, he of course begins to slowly die. Pepper comes to his side and tells him that you can finally rest. He then dies and everybody starts to bawl their eyes out. In Tony's hologram farewell message, he says that if you would have told me a few years ago we're not alone in the universe, I wouldn't have believed the extent. This is a reference to the very first post-credit scene in the MCU where Fury tells Tony he's not alone, and this is where the very first Avengers initiative began. So it's amazing that the end is referencing the beginning. We see Tony's first arc reactor that Pepper made for him that says proof that Tony Stark has a heart. At his funeral, all of the heroes are there, including Happy Hogan, Hank Pym, and Harley Keener, the little boy from Iron Man 3. Many people did not know who that teenage boy was, but it is in fact Harley Keener, quite possibly setting it up for him in the future to become Iron Lad or Iron Man, and definitely a possibility for a future Young Avengers. After the funeral, Wanda and Clint reunite, and he tells her that he wishes he could tell her that we won. And Wanda says she knows. They both do. Now some people think that Wanda is referring to Natasha and Gamora, but I think she's referring to Natasha and Vision. Thor joins the Guardians of the Galaxy, setting up Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and creating the Asgardians of the Galaxy, which in fact was a comic. We then cut to a scene where Captain America is going to go back in time to return all of the Infinity Stones at the time where they took them. Captain says to Bucky, "Hey, don't do anything stupid until I get back," and Bucky says, "How can I? You're taking all the stupid with you." This is the same exact conversation that they had in Captain America the First Avenger, except it was reversed. Bucky then says, "I'm going to miss you," because Bucky knows that Captain is not going to come back. He's going to stay in the past. And that's exactly what happens. Professor Hulk explains that he's only going to be gone for 5 seconds in their time, but for him it'll take as long as he needs. Of course, 5 seconds goes by and he doesn't come back. Instead, old man Captain America is waiting on a bench. He explains that he stayed back in time, and the Russo brothers have explained that he did in fact create an alternate timeline, but he simply returned to this timeline at the end to give Falcon the Captain America shield so he can become the new Captain America. This is something that happens in the comics. In fact, Bucky also becomes Captain America at some point in time in the comics as well, which is why we see Falcon look at Bucky and Bucky gives a nod of approval, saying that it's okay, you can be Captain America. This is something that will most likely see play out in the new Bucky and Falcon TV series on Disney+. And of course we find out that Steve finally got his dance with Peggy Carter, married her, and lived out his life happily. And of course, after the credits, we hear a clanking noise. This is a reference to the very first Iron Man film where Iron Man makes the very first Mach 1 Iron Man suit. That was the very first movie that started the MCU, and Avengers Endgame is the movie that is wrapping up the story arc for the first 11 years of the MCU. So the post-credit scene brings it full circle. And that's it for my complete breakdown of Avengers Endgame and all of its Easter eggs. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about Avengers Endgame in the comments down below. If you're new to my channel, be sure to subscribe so you can stay up to date on everything relating to Avengers Endgame, all things Marvel, and all things superhero. As always, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.
Hey, congratulations to your desperation to save the universe. You killed half of its population. Yeah, you did it. Very nice. And all it took, you said it cost you everything while crying like a baby. Now you're at number